Highlights Chapter 6, Diagnosis Freedom, the Civil War, Emancipation, and Fin du Siècle, Medical Research, Changing Times. The regular, simple life, the hygienic conditions, the freedom from dissipation and excitement, steady and healthful employment, enforced self-restraint, the freedom from care and responsibility, the plain, wholesome, nourishing food, comfortable clothing, the open-air life upon the plantation, the care and treatment when sick. In those days, all acted as preventive measures against mental breakdown in the Negro. Dr. William P. Drury, Superintendent, Virginia State Hospital for the Mentally Insane, 1908. A witty statesman said, "You might prove anything by figures," Thomas Carlyle. Diagnosis, Freedom, Will Bryce. By 1840, the South's grip on slavery was loosening. Southern whites feared that a proliferation of free, pale-skinned mulattoes would soon efface the all-important social boundary between white and black, rendering whiteness meaningless. Scientific racists rode to the rescue by explaining that mulattoes were too weak and infertile to infiltrate and replace whites. Dr. Josiah Nott explained that mulattoes were an infertile, weak species who died at a younger age than did whites and whose progeny were feeble. Legal minds scaled the mountain of constitutional support for slavery. Philosophers expounded upon the natural law that made blacks inherently subservient to whites. And spiritual leaders cited reams of biblical and moral sanctions for enslavement. But scientific medicine was beginning to trump other philosophies. However, by the 1840s, the larger American social climate was inimical to slavery. The nation had become a lonely Western trafficker in human chattel. The medical rationale for slavery, that inferior and feeble blacks were simply unable to govern and care for themselves, was derided as insular and self-serving and counted few active sympathizers outside the South. In this contentious climate, the 6th U.S. Census of 1840 began enumerating whites and free and enslaved blacks. For the first time, the census also undertook to count the insane and idiots, 19th century argot for the mentally ill and intellectually challenged. Racism by numbers. It revealed that free blacks suffered far worse health, especially far worse mental health, than did enslaved blacks. These data bolstered pro-slavery arguments by providing copious statistical proof that slavery was essential to preserve the health of blacks. This powerful scientific argument for slavery was fed by research conducted by the presumably disinterested federal government. slavery's defenders quickly roused themselves to explain to naive Northerners the dangers of freedom for the sickly freedmen of the North, who sank into debilitating insanity when faced with having to provide for themselves, or indeed to undergo any of the pressures of daily life that whites managed as a matter of course. They claimed that blacks lacked the mature judgment of whites and were unable to resist the allure of liquor, indiscriminate sex, constant dancing, and frequent fighting. Blacks' fertility had also fallen, allegedly because they were murderously indifferent mothers and absent fathers in the best of circumstances. Slavery was also thought necessary to protect whites because freely roaming sick blacks were perceived as vectors of infectious disease. The secret to happiness is freedom, and the secret to freedom is courage, said Thucydides. So little trouble do men take in search for the truth, Thucydides observed. So readily do they accept whatever comes first at hand. Powerful statistical arguments for slavery were widely accepted in the corridors of power, and census data spiced many a fiery political speech delivered by powerful politicians. The message found an especially vociferous champion in Secretary of State John C. Calhoun, a former medical student and an inveterate Southern advocate of slavery. The shocked political opponents of slavery, intimidated by the statistical weight of the numbers and by the impeccable prestige of the U.S. Census, never mounted a coordinated refutation of the census. The census research did contribute to a revitalization of slavery until the early 1860s. However, the celebrated census data were deeply flawed. Dr. Edward Jarvis investigated and found that the census was a fallacious and self-condemning document, a mixture of accidental and intentional falsehoods. Some northern towns that had no black residents at all were credited by the census with insane Negroes. His damning indictment of the census criticized only the northern data. Dr. James McCune Smith of Harvard had deftly analyzed both the northern and southern numbers. His clear analysis addressed the flaws in the southern data, revealing that the census's methodology was so deeply flawed that it was tantamount to libel regarding the health and mental status of African Americans. Smith understood that black mental illness was destined to be under-enumerated in the South, where there was almost no accommodation for diagnosis and mental health treatment. Blacks were typically barred from mental hospitals, and those too deranged to work were dumped into almshouses or jails, into which census marshals did not venture. Enumerators took an owner's word that his slaves were healthy, by which owners meant not emotionally healthy, but simply fit to work. Some planters misrepresented their slaves as free persons to avoid taxes. On May 3, 1844, Smith submitted to the United States Senate a memorial, a shrewd analysis of the census document, denuding its many fallacies and reducing it to an absurdity without sanctuary. You can't replace these white boys, but if a nigger dies, all you have to do is send out and get another one. Still, it was much safer and healthier to be a black soldier than a black civilian. Most slaves fled the plantations when the war began, and most free blacks fled the South. This internal nation of homeless roamed northward, hungry, tattered, sick, and penniless, seeking safe harbor. During its peak year, 1866, the Army's Freedmen's Bureau health system comprised 46 field hospitals, 52 colonies, asylums, and dispensaries, smaller clinics, 118 physicians, and 406 hospital attendants. Waves of sick blacks were herded into camps without adequate nutrition, sanitation, or medical care. Only 138 physicians ever cared for the 1.1 million freemen who eventually lived in the camps, and many of these doctors expressed disdain for the black animals, as at least one doctor called the contraband in front of relief workers. Some flatly refused to care for them. The results were predictable. 1 out of every 4 freemen died in the camps. When the war ended, Martin L. Delaney, MD, who had distinguished himself as an officer and surgeon during the war, headed the Freedmen's Bureau, but its medical services were sabotaged by a lack of financial support. When the Freedmen's camps dissolved, no public health support replaced them. Disease and death ran rampant through black populations. 19th century scientific medicine, bolstered by census data, perpetuated the belief that blacks' inherent inferiorities, not exposure, starvation, and neglect, caused their public health issues. By the census of 1890, black extinction was actually predicted for the year 2000. Therefore, the census apologist saw preventive and corrective measures such as better housing, healthcare, and nutrition as futile. This tendency to see environmentally and socially triggered illnesses as inherent defects of blacks is a troublingly persistent trend in American medical research. The chief distortions of the census were intentional falsehoods, and these constitute another powerful example of how scientific fraud and abuse have often been traveling partners when it comes to research into African American health. Fin du siècle, French for end of the century, both the closing and onset of an era. The advent of the century saw a complete reversal of this basic mantra of scientific racism. Medicine had once justified slavery on the basis that blacks were hardier than whites, and so were ideally suited to survive and to work in harsh climates that would have meant death to the more delicate whites. Now it was African Americans who were judged too delicate to survive. A familiar theme of medical journals and popular magazine articles alike became "Will Blacks Survive the New Century?" Within a decade of its identification, late 1904, the erroneous belief that sickle cell anemia strikes only blacks became firmly entrenched, thus reinforcing belief in the inherent inferiority of African Americans. African American physicians did not passively accept damning indictments of black physiology. Daniel L. Williams, who performed the first successful open heart operation, founded Providence Hospital in 1893. In 1897, Dr. Alonzo McLennan opened a hospital and nurse training school. By 1916, Dr. Matilda Evans of South Carolina had opened 3 different hospitals there. Eventually, 7 African American medical schools joined these to provide the long-awaited entree to medical education for Africans.